Welcome to Lullaby of Lore. If you like the videos, please consider supporting the channel on Ko-fi and the merch store, and thank you for watching. Vampire courts and bloodline politics, the undead aristocracy of D&D. Picture a lord sitting at the head of a banquet table. The food is exquisite, the wine is expensive, the guests are beautifully dressed and impeccably mannered. Conversation is witty, the candlelight is warm, and the evening has every quality of a civilized gathering among people who appreciate the finer things. Then you notice that the Lord has not touched his food. You notice that he has not moved in a very long time. You notice that his smile does not reach his eyes, which are fixed on you with an attention that feels less like admiration and more like evaluation. You realize with a creeping certainty that you are not a guest at this dinner. You are the course that comes after. This is the world of the vampire as D&D has built it across 50 years of lore. Not a shambling monster in a graveyard, though vampires can be that too, but something far more unsettling. A predator wearing the mask of civilization. A creature that has studied humanity for centuries and learned to replicate its forms perfectly, not because it values those forms, but because they are useful. The aristocratic vampire, the vampire lord surrounded by courts and intrigues and centuries of accumulated power, is one of the most enduring images in all of D&D, and understanding what drives these creatures and how they organize themselves reveals something important about what undeath actually does to a person. The vampire has been part of D&D since the original White Box rules in 1974, introduced as a powerful undead creature with level-draining attacks and an array of supernatural abilities. In those earliest rules, the vampire was primarily a combat challenge, a monster to be defeated rather than a society to be navigated. What happened in the decades since is one of the most interesting developments in D&D's history. The vampire was gradually promoted from monster to civilization. The introduction of Strahd von Zarovich in 1983's module I-6, Ravenloft, gave the vampire archetype a backstory, a psychology, and a domain that reflected its ruler's inner life. The Ravenloft campaign setting that followed turned a single vampire lord into an entire tradition of vampire lore that shaped how D&D and fantasy role-playing broadly conceived of what vampires are and what they want. What that tradition ultimately established is that the vampire is most interesting not as a creature to kill, but as a civilization to understand. The court politics, the bloodline hierarchies, the economics of feeding territory and spawn creation, the specific psychology of immortal beings who were once mortal, these are the elements that make vampire lore compelling and that reward the kind of deep examination we are about to undertake. The transformation and what it costs. To understand vampire courts and bloodline politics, you must first understand what the transformation creates. A vampire is not a human being with some extra abilities and a dietary restriction. The transformation is a profound corruption of everything that person was, a process by which the living soul is either destroyed or fundamentally altered, replaced by something animated by negative energy and driven by hungers that have no natural counterpart in mortal experience. The process begins with the bite. A vampire drains blood from a victim over time, and if that victim is buried after death rather than cremated or left to rot above ground, they rise the following night as a vampire spawn, bound absolutely to the will of the vampire that created them. They do not choose this. They do not consent to it. Their prior self, their values, their relationships, their sense of who they were, all of it remains accessible as memory, but increasingly irrelevant as the new hungers assert themselves. A vampire spawn is not a full vampire. It is something closer to a sophisticated thrall, possessed of the basic capabilities of undeath, but lacking the independence that comes with a true vampire's nature. Spawn cannot create other vampires. They cannot act against their sire's wishes. The bond between sire and spawn is absolute and involuntary, a psychic tether that the spawn feels as a constant presence, a voice they cannot ignore, regardless of how much they might wish to. The only path from spawn to true vampire runs through the sire. If a true vampire allows their spawn to drink directly from their own body, consuming the blood of the undead master rather than simply being drained by them, the spawn transforms. The psychic bond breaks. The spawn becomes a full vampire, free-willed, capable of creating spawn of their own, and suddenly a potential threat to the sire who elevated them. This is why true vampires are extraordinarily reluctant to perform this elevation. Every true vampire they create is a potential rival, a creature with knowledge of the sire's vulnerabilities, habits, and plans, now free to act on that knowledge however they choose. The emotional transformation that accompanies vampirism is documented in detail in Forgotten Realms lore and provides the psychological foundation for understanding everything about how vampire courts function. The transformation does not erase memory. A vampire remembers everything about their former life. What it does is corrupt emotional associations. Love, which in living beings motivates protection and sacrifice, becomes obsession in undeath. The vampire who loved someone in life becomes fixated on that person in a way that has no warmth in it, only possession and hunger. Friendship becomes jealousy. Loyalty becomes resentment of those to whom it was directed. The specific character of the distortion varies, but the pattern is consistent. Whatever the vampire most valued in life becomes the shape of their most destructive impulse in undeath. This corruption explains why vampire politics are so consistently vicious, even among those who maintain civilized surfaces. Every creature in a vampire court is operating from a psychology that inverts genuine connection into something predatory. When a vampire lord appears to care about a member of their court, the behavior mimics care well enough to deceive, but it is driven by something that serves the vampire's own needs rather than the well-being of the other. The courtly forms are real. The underlying motivation is not what it appears to be. The nature of vampire power. What a vampire becomes after transformation depends significantly on what they were before it. The transformation preserves and amplifies rather than creating from nothing. A warrior who becomes a vampire retains their martial skill and gains supernatural strength and resilience on top of it. A wizard who becomes a vampire retains their magical knowledge and gains the ability to fuel their spells with negative energy. A charismatic noble who becomes a vampire retains their social skills, their knowledge of politics and manipulation, and their understanding of how power operates among the living, which they can now apply to the extended timescale that immortality provides. This is why the most dangerous vampires are almost invariably those who were already capable and accomplished in life. Strahd von Zarovich, the most iconic vampire in all of D&D, was a general and conqueror before his transformation. He brought to his vampiric existence centuries of accumulated experience in strategy, tactics, political manipulation, and the management of populations. His understanding of how people think, how they can be motivated by fear and rewarded with hope, how to create dependencies and exploit them, all of this was present before the transformation and has only deepened across the centuries since. The powers that vampires develop over time are significant, both for their utility and for what they reveal about the fundamental nature of undead existence. A vampire can charm with a glance, imposing on a victim the belief that the vampire is a trusted friend worthy of obedience and protection. This power works because the vampire's gaze carries something of the negative energy that animates it, a direct assault on the victim's will that is experienced not as violation, but as affection. The charmed person does not feel controlled. They feel connection, which is the most insidious possible form of control. The charm ability is particularly important in court politics because it allows a vampire lord to maintain a portion of their court in a state of willing compliance without the messy complications of genuine loyalty. Charmed individuals behave as allies without being allies. They report accurately, act protectively, and follow instructions with a sincerity that no amount of political calculation could replicate, because the charm produces genuine, if artificially induced, emotional investment. The risk is that charm effects can be broken by harm done to the charmed individual or by magical dispelling. And a charmed servant who becomes a former charmed servant has just become someone who knows they were controlled and has intimate knowledge of the controller. Managing this risk is a constant preoccupation of any vampire lord who relies heavily on charmed proxies. A vampire can transform into a bat or a mist, escaping confinement and injury with ease. The mist form in particular is revealing. A vampire reduced to 0 hit points does not die. It dissolves into vapor and drifts back to its resting place, where it slowly regenerates over the course of hours. Destroying a vampire completely requires sustained effort specifically targeted at its coffin, the burial soil it depends on, or exposure to sunlight or running water. Short of these specific conditions, the vampire simply withdraws, recovers, and returns. This near impossibility of permanent death shapes everything about how other creatures deal with vampires. You cannot simply defeat one and consider the matter resolved. The vampire's connection to the creatures of the night, the ability to call swarms of bats and rats and packs of wolves, reflects a deep attunement to the predatory side of the natural world. The wolf hunts, the bat feeds in darkness, the rat spreads disease and thrives on death. These are not coincidental associations. The vampire presides over an aspect of nature that civilization prefers not to acknowledge. The part that is about consuming rather than creating, about the death that feeds new life. The vampire's command of these creatures is a kind of dark stewardship over that portion of the world, and in the context of court politics, it provides a vast and distributed surveillance network that no human intelligence organization could match. The vermin of a vampire's city are its eyes and ears in every cellar, every back alley, and every space that human attention does not reach. And the lair itself tells a story. Within 500 feet of where a vampire makes its home, plants wither into twisted brambles. Shadows move independently of their sources. Fog clings to the ground and takes shapes that might be faces or hands. The population of vermin swells. The land itself becomes an expression of what inhabits it, as if the vampire's unnatural presence seeps into the surrounding reality and leaves it changed. This corruption lifts within days of the vampire's destruction, which means it is also evidence. A region showing these signs is almost certainly home to a vampire. And the degree of the corruption suggests something about how long and how powerful that presence has been. The older and more powerful the vampire lord, the more thoroughgoing the transformation of the surrounding landscape, until in extreme cases like Barovia, entire territories become expressions of their ruler's psychological state made manifest in the physical world. The sire bond and what it creates. The relationship between a vampire and its spawn is unlike any other relationship in D&D because it is both totally involuntary and completely intimate. The sire can perceive through the spawn's senses if they choose to focus. They can hear the spawn's thoughts. They can compel obedience at any moment, overriding whatever the spawn was doing or planning in an instant. The spawn is aware of this connection at all times. They know they are not private even in their own mind. This absolute surveillance creates a very particular psychology in vampire spawn. They are not slaves in the sense of beings who endure captivity while secretly wishing for freedom. The psychic connection runs deep enough that many spawn genuinely internalize their sire's desires and values, not because those values are compelling, but because the boundary between self and sire has been partially dissolved. A spawn's most private thoughts are already shared with the sire, whether the spawn wishes it or not. Over time, this tends to erode the sense of a separate interior life. The spawn becomes, in effect, an extension of the sire's will that experiences itself as an individual, but finds that individuality has been hollowed out. The rare spawn who maintains a strong enough sense of self to resist this process is the most dangerous kind, not to those outside the relationship, but to the sire. A spawn who has preserved genuine interiority while being fully aware of how the bond works, knows more about their sire than almost anyone in the world, and has every reason to want that bond broken. When the sire eventually dies, either through the efforts of adventurers or through the political machinations of vampire courts, these spawn do not grieve. They become suddenly, violently free, their suppressed individuality asserting itself all at once. This dynamic, the absolute power of the sire over the spawn, the knowledge the spawn accumulates, and the constant low-level tension between them, is the foundation on which all vampire social structures are built. Even when no spawn is actively plotting against their sire, the sire knows that the potential exists. The more spawn a vampire elevates to full vampire status, the more potential rivals it creates. The choice of whom to elevate and when is among the most consequential decisions any vampire makes, and the most cautious vampires make it as rarely as possible. the right of succession, and the logic of patricide. One of the most revealing aspects of vampire court culture is how lordship changes hands, because the dominant tradition in the Forgotten Realms is not inheritance, not abdication, not democratic succession. It is murder. The specific ritual known in some vampire traditions as the rite of perfect slaughter formalizes what would otherwise simply be an act of violence into something with recognized legitimacy. A spawn who kills their sire and takes their place is not considered a criminal by other vampires. They are considered a lord. The act itself, the betrayal and destruction of the being who created you and held you in absolute captivity, is the qualification for leadership. This tradition is almost perfectly designed to produce the specific kind of vampire lord it creates. A vampire who has successfully killed their sire has demonstrated exactly the combination of capabilities that court management requires. Patience, because the sire's absolute perception of the spawn makes any premature attempt suicidal. Intelligence, because the sire must be maneuvered into vulnerability rather than simply attacked. Ruthlessness, because hesitation at the critical moment means death, and a specific kind of cold pragmatism, because the emotional dimension of the relationship with the sire, however corrupted and painful, must be suppressed or leveraged rather than resolved. A vampire who feels genuine grief at their sire's death is a vampire who hesitated, and a vampire who hesitated is usually a dead one. Kazzador's path to lordship followed this pattern precisely. He endured decades of what his own sire Veliath practiced on him, absorbed the specific humiliations and punishments that defined that relationship, and waited until the moment was right to execute the rite of perfect slaughter. What the tradition gave him was not just the title of Vampire Lord of Baldur's Gate. It gave him a detailed understanding, forged through personal experience, of exactly how a vampire lord maintains control over spawn. He knew because he had been controlled. He could replicate the techniques because he had survived them. Every method he later used on Asterion and his other close spawn was drawn from the catalog of what had been done to him. This creates one of the darkest recursive patterns in vampire society. The cruelty is not gratuitous or random. It is institutional, transmitted from sire to spawn with the fidelity of any other form of expertise. Because the spawn, who eventually performs the rite of perfect slaughter and becomes a lord, will use what they learned from their captivity as the template for managing their own court. The victims become perpetrators not despite their suffering, but because of it. The transformation preserves what was done to them in a form that can be applied to others. The court as structure and as performance. Most vampires in their natural state are solitary. The default behavior of a newly freed vampire, or one operating in an area with no established power structure, is to find a defensible lair, build up a stable feeding territory, and operate alone. Cooperation requires trust, and vampires are fundamentally ill-equipped for trust. Their psychology makes them suspicious of everyone, prone to seeing affection as a technique and generosity as manipulation, because these things are genuinely techniques and manipulation in their own behavior. Despite this, vampire courts form. They form because power accumulates, because older and stronger vampires find that managing extensive territory is easier with subordinates, and because the forms of aristocratic civilization that many vampires were familiar with in life provide a ready-made social structure that can be adapted to undead purposes. A lord needs a court. A court needs courtiers. A vampire who wants to rule a city the way they might have ruled it in life needs something that resembles a court, even if every member of that court would betray every other member given sufficient incentive. The result is a social structure that resembles human aristocracy in its outward forms while operating on entirely different underlying rules. The titles are real. The ceremonies are observed. Hierarchy is maintained, and violations of precedents are taken very seriously. But the loyalty that animates human courts, the genuine bonds of affection and shared interest that hold living political structures together, is entirely absent. What replaces it is mutual awareness of mutual vulnerability. Every vampire in a court knows things about every other vampire that could be used against them. They know where the others sleep. They know the specifics of their transformation, which affects what vulnerabilities they carry. They know the details of the spawn hierarchies and which spawn might be more loyal to a particular court member than to the Lord. They know old plans and old promises and old failures. This shared knowledge creates a kind of enforced stability. Betraying a member of the court is likely to produce retaliation, not just from that member, but from others who fear that whoever just got betrayed might have known their own secrets and shared them as insurance. The vampire lord at the head of the court maintains position through a combination of raw power, strategic information, and the careful management of relationships. They cannot trust their court members, but they can make themselves indispensable to them. The court member who depends on the Lord for their feeding territory, for protection from hunters, for access to the resources that make an extended vampire existence comfortable, is less likely to take the enormous risk of moving against the Lord, even if they would prefer to. The Tyrants of Sharn, a major vampire criminal organization documented in Eberron's lore, demonstrate how this structure operates at an urban level. Composed primarily of changelings and vampires, the Tyrants have infiltrated institutions throughout the city, including, by rumor, the city council itself. Their power comes not from open domination, but from layered information and leverage. They know secrets, they have favors owed, they have placed individuals in positions of influence through decades of patient work. Attacking them directly accomplishes nothing, because the real threat is what they know and who they control. Feeding territory and the economy of blood. The most fundamental resource in any vampire's existence is access to blood, and the management of that access is the economic foundation on which all vampire political structures rest. Blood sustains them, blood heals them. Blood is what they kill for, and the question of who is allowed to feed on whom in which areas of a given city or territory is among the most jealously guarded political arrangements in any vampire court. A vampire lord who controls a significant city effectively presides over a food source of enormous value. The citizens of that city, most of whom have no idea they are living inside a vampire's feeding territory, represent decades or centuries of sustainable sustenance. Managing them is not unlike managing livestock, a comparison that would horrify those citizens if they understood it, but which the vampire lord has long since stopped finding troubling. The lord sets rules about how much feeding is permitted within the city limits, how frequently a given individual can be targeted, and whether or how often a feeding should result in the creation of new spawn. Excessive feeding attracts hunters and investigators. Insufficient feeding leaves the court unsatisfied and politically unstable. The balance requires constant management. Feeding rights are among the most valuable things a vampire lord can grant to a court member. The right to feed in a particular district, the right to maintain a small number of charmed humans as a personal supply, the right to select from prisoners held in the court's underground facilities. These are the rewards that keep court members in line and competing for favor, rather than conspiring against the Lord. A court member who has been denied feeding rights, formally or informally, is a court member who is being threatened with a very slow form of destruction, and they know it. The practice of maintaining charmed humans as a personal larder is documented in Forgotten Realms lore and represents one of the most disturbing aspects of vampire court life. These individuals, charmed into a state of willing compliance, serve as reliable blood sources for the vampire who maintains them. They believe themselves to be willing. They do not understand the nature of the charm that has been imposed on them. In many cases, they have served in this capacity for years, their memories of the arrangement carefully managed by the vampire who feeds on them. And they have built entire identities around their relationship with their vampire patron. When the charm is eventually broken, if it is ever broken, the psychological damage tends to be severe. Some courts develop more elaborate systems. A vampire lord with a talent for long-term planning might invest decades in cultivating specific families, keeping them charmed across generations, managing their bloodlines the way a mortal farmer might manage a prize herd. The family believes themselves to be in the service of a powerful and generous patron. The truth is more complicated. These arrangements have persisted in some Forgotten Realm cities for centuries without being discovered. The vampire lords face changing every generation as they adopt a new persona appropriate to the era, while the family's service continues under different names and in different forms. In cities where multiple vampires operate, the management of feeding territory requires either a dominant lord who sets the rules for everyone else, or a negotiated arrangement among peers that tends to be inherently unstable. The dominant lord model, as seen in Baldur's Gate under Kazzador Sar and in Waterdeep under Artur Morlin, has the advantage of clarity. Everyone knows who sets the rules, and violations are dealt with directly. The peer arrangement requires constant renegotiation and is vulnerable to the first participant who decides that the agreement is less advantageous than simply eliminating the others. The neutrality of locations in vampire court politics deserves specific attention. Vampire lords who occupy the same city or region but are not yet committed to open conflict sometimes maintain informal arrangements about certain spaces. A particular tavern where business can be conducted without violence, a particular district that serves as neutral ground for negotiation, a particular figure such as a high priest or powerful archwizard whose position is acknowledged by all parties as too dangerous to touch. These arrangements create pockets of predictability within vampire politics, locations and relationships that function as circuit breakers on the constant low-level potential for escalation to open war. These neutral spaces are valuable not just as meeting places, but as intelligence markets. When vampire lords cannot afford to trust their own court members with sensitive information, the neutral ground where rival factions meet becomes one of the few places where reliable information can be obtained. A vampire lord who wants to know what a rival is planning will sometimes find it easier to conduct a careful conversation in a neutral location than to use their own spy networks, which the rival knows about and has likely already compromised in return. The information economy of vampire politics runs largely through these spaces of mutual grudging acknowledgement that sometimes cooperation is less costly than constant conflict. The broader question of what a vampire lord wants from their feeding territory over the very long term reveals something important about how immortal ambition operates differently from mortal ambition. A mortal noble who controls a city wants to exploit that control within their lifetime. They extract taxes, build monuments, pursue wars, engage in the specific forms of ambition that make sense within a human lifespan. A vampire lord who controls a city is thinking across centuries. They want the city to remain viable as a feeding source indefinitely. They have an interest in its prosperity that no mortal ruler fully shares, because mortal rulers do not expect to be there for the consequences of short-term exploitation 100 years hence. The vampire lord does. This creates a form of governance that is simultaneously more patient and more predatory than mortal rulership. Patient in strategic terms because the vampire can afford to wait for favorable conditions, predatory in fundamental terms because the city's population is, ultimately, food. Kazzador Sar and the Baldur's Gate Court. Few vampire lords in recent Forgotten Realms history demonstrate the specific mechanics and horrors of vampire court politics as clearly as Kazzador Sar, the vampire lord of Baldur's Gate, whose ambitions and methods are detailed extensively in Baldur's Gate 3. Kazzador's court is not large in the traditional sense, but it is a precise and deeply revealing illustration of how a vampire lord thinks about power, about subordinates, and about the future. Kazzador was himself the spawn of a vampire lord named Veliath the Martinet, and he became the vampire lord of Baldur's Gate in the year 1276 DR by killing his master in what the relevant traditions call the rite of perfect slaughter. The name is revealing. Becoming a vampire lord in the tradition Kazzador inherited requires the murder of one's sire. The elevation from spawn to full vampire and from full vampire to acknowledged lord is accomplished through violence against the very figure who created you and held absolute power over you. This structure ensures that every vampire lord carries within them a specific psychology. They have already done the thing most spawn only fantasize about, and they know how it is done, which means they are vigilant about every one of their own spawn in ways that would be paranoid in a mortal context, but are simply prudent in theirs. Kazzador kept 7 spawn as what he called his children: Astarion, Leon, Aurelia, Yusin, Violet, Deliria, and Pale Petrus. These 7 were distinct from the thousands of other spawn he maintained in the dungeons beneath his palace. The 7 received something that functioned like attention and something that functioned like intimacy, which in a vampire lord means they received the most concentrated and personal form of psychological torment available. They were close enough to their master to understand exactly how complete his control over them was. They were powerful enough to occasionally believe they might escape it. They were never free. What makes Kazzador particularly significant as a case study is the nature of his ambition. He was not content with being a vampire lord. He had learned of an ancient ritual, the rite of profane ascension, which he called the Black Mass, that would transform him into something beyond ordinary vampirism, a state called the Vampire Ascendant, that would retain all of a vampire's power while removing the fundamental weaknesses, the vulnerability to sunlight, the dependence on blood, the fear of running water, and holy symbols that normally constrain what a vampire lord can accomplish. To fuel this ritual, he needed 7,000 souls, those of his spawn, including his 7 close spawn, all of which he had been accumulating and preparing across more than a century. The infernal contracts he carved into the backs of his 7 close spawn were not merely a symbol of ownership. They were the mechanism of the ritual, a deal with the archdevil Mephistopheles, whose terms required that the marked spawn be sacrificed as part of the ascension. Kazzador had been preparing his court for this moment across the entire span of his lordship. Every spawn he created was a tool being readied for a specific purpose. Every connection he maintained with his 7 close spawn was a manipulation designed to keep them available and controllable when the time came. This planning across centuries, the willingness to treat every relationship as an investment that will eventually be liquidated, is one of the most chilling aspects of advanced vampire court psychology. Kazzador did not think of his 7 close spawn as people. He thought of them as resources whose current value in their present form was less than their future value as ritual fuel. His patience in waiting is not admirable. It is the patience of something that has removed genuine feeling from its relationship with others so completely that the question of what those others suffer simply does not register as relevant information. His letter to the vampire lord Mizal Alkam of Athkatla, a city where another vampire coven operates, reveals something important about how vampire lords relate to each year level. Kazzador was aware that he was not the only vampire lord managing a significant city, and he felt the competitive pressure of this awareness. His letter to Alkam reads less like diplomatic correspondence and more like a declaration of intent. He intended to become something that would make Alkam's achievements look minor by comparison. The existence of other vampire courts does not produce solidarity. It produces competition, and competition at the vampire lord level is measured in centuries. Artur Morlin and the Waterdeep model. The vampire known as Artur Morlin, the Baron of Blood, represents a very different model of urban vampire politics from Kazzador's accumulation toward apocalypse approach. Artur has dwelt in Waterdeep since the Second Troll War, a span of time that makes him one of the oldest continuously operating vampire lords in the Forgotten Realms. He holds a position as one of Waterdeep's masked lords, the secretive oligarchy that rules the city, a fact known to almost no one and maintained through a combination of power, information, and the careful management of his public persona. What is remarkable about Artur's approach to vampire politics is its fundamental conservatism. He has chosen stability over ambition, sustainable predation over accumulation, long-term security over dramatic power grabs. Waterdeep is his hunting preserve, as he thinks of it, and he manages it accordingly. He keeps the number of vampires operating in the city very low, dealing personally with any rival who tries to establish a presence, not out of generosity toward the city's inhabitants, but out of self-interest. A city with multiple competing vampire predators is a city that eventually attracts hunters, and hunters represent a threat to Artur's centuries of carefully built security. His position among the masked lords is the product of exactly the kind of long-game political investment that vampire immortality makes possible. A mortal political operative has decades to accumulate leverage and build networks. Artur has centuries. He has cultivated relationships with families whose grandparents he knew when they were young, whose political positions he helped arrange, whose secrets he has held for generations. The network of obligation and information he has built is not something that can be quickly assembled by a newer arrival. It represents the accumulated work of centuries of patient manipulation. Ardor's model stands as an implicit argument against the more aggressive approaches taken by lords like Kazzador. Where Kazzador was building toward a dramatic transformation that required massive disruption and would have attracted enormous attention, Ardor has built something that perpetuates itself quietly. His court is not a formal structure with titled positions. It is a web of relationships, dependencies, and carefully maintained information monopolies. It does not announce itself, it simply persists. Orbach of Westgate and the Criminal Court. A third model of vampire political organization appears in the story of the vampire known as Orbach, and his history is one of the strangest in all of Forgotten Realms lore because of what he was before he became what he is. Orbach is a clone of Manshun, the founder of the Gentarim, one of the most powerful and feared archmages in Farron's history. When Manshun was betrayed and killed in 1370 DR, over a dozen clones he had created for exactly this contingency awakened simultaneously, each believing itself to be the real Manshun and driven by a compulsion to destroy the others. Most of the clones were destroyed in the resulting chaos. One of those that survived had been placed in magical stasis and discovered by the vampire lord Orlach, the Night King of Westgate, who transformed it while it slept. When this Manshun clone awoke, he discovered that he was a vampire and that the Night King had been waiting patiently to see what would happen. What happened was that the clone killed Orlach, took his title of Night King, and set about transforming Westgate's criminal underworld into something that resembled a sophisticated political organization. He called himself Orbach, and eventually Orlach II, and built the Night Masks from a conventional criminal guild into a vampire-dominated power structure that controlled significant portions of Westgate's economy through a combination of charm, blackmail, and violence. He had all of Manshun's centuries of political and magical expertise combined with a vampire's specific tools of control. The result was formidable. Orbach's story illustrates something important about what vampirism adds to an already exceptional individual. Manshun was already brilliant, already patient, already willing to operate across long-time horizons and to view every interaction as a potential strategic investment. Vampirism gave him immortality, supernatural charm, and the ability to create and control spawn, amplifying capabilities he already possessed rather than creating new ones. The vampire court he built in Westgate was essentially a criminal empire that happened to be staffed primarily by undead, and it operated according to the same logic that any sophisticated criminal organization uses. Layers of deniability, information compartmentalization, leverage over key individuals in legitimate institutions, and the credible threat of violence for anyone who decided that cooperation was less attractive than defection, Strahd, and the perfect court. No discussion of vampire lords and their courts can proceed without substantial treatment of Count Strahd von Zarovich, the vampire who has defined the archetype for D&D more completely than any other. Strahd is not simply the oldest and most powerful vampire in official D&D lore, though he is that. He is the clearest illustration of what the vampire court becomes when given centuries to develop and refine itself. Strahd was born Strahd von Zarovich, a prince and general who spent his youth and middle age in military conquest and the management of territories won by war. He was brilliant, ruthless, and fully aware of how power operated in his world. When he retired to the Valley of Barovia and had Castle Ravenloft constructed, he brought that understanding with him, along with the specific bitterness of a man who had sacrificed youth to duty and arrived at middle age with nothing to show for it that he actually wanted. His brother Sergei came to Barovia young and beautiful, and with him came Tatiana, a woman of such grace that Strahd found himself consumed by a desire he had never felt before and had no idea how to handle. Tatiana loved Sergei. She did not love Strahd. The general who had commanded armies found himself helpless in the face of a rejection he could not counter by force or strategy. The jealousy this produced corroded everything else in him, and he began to make choices that could not be unmade. He made a pact with the Dark Powers, those mysterious entities who collect Dark Lords for the domains of dread, exchanging his soul for the power he believed would allow him to have what he wanted. And no, he murdered Sergei on the day of his wedding. And when Tatiana, faced with the man who had killed her beloved, flung herself from the battlements of Castle Ravenloft, the Dark Powers collected on their bargain. Strahd became a vampire, and Barovia, the land he had conquered and ruled, folded itself into the domains of dread and became his eternal prison. What makes Strahd compelling as a figure rather than merely as a powerful enemy is that his court is not simply a power structure, it is a monument to a specific moment of failure. Every element of Barovia, every creature in his service, every system of control he has built across the centuries exists in relation to that moment when Tatiana jumped from the battlements and he was left with everything he had wanted except the only thing that mattered. He rules a perfect kingdom. He is completely alone in it. And because the Dark Powers have arranged things so that Tatiana's soul keeps returning, reincarnating in different bodies in different eras of Barovian history, he is forced again and again to experience a version of the original scenario. He finds her, he tries to claim her, she rejects him, she dies, and he continues. His court is organized around the management of this eternal cycle and the suppression of the NY that threatens to consume him between cycles. The vampire spawn he has created over centuries serve as instruments of control and occasional objects of what passes for attention. His castle is filled with the accumulated artifacts of 500 years of existence, collected not from genuine appreciation, but from the need to fill space that would otherwise be empty. He is a collector in the way that all vampires become collectors, accumulating things because the alternative is facing the void where meaning used to be. The Barovian court operates through fear so thorough and so long established that it has become the baseline of reality for those living under it. Wolves guard the roads, mists prevent escape. The castle looms over the valley as a constant reminder of who owns it. The human inhabitants of Barovia exist in a state of resigned survival, having given up generations ago on the idea that their circumstances might change. The few who resist become heroes or die trying or both, and their resistance, while it occasionally disturbs Strahd's equilibrium, ultimately confirms his power by demonstrating that it takes extraordinary individuals to challenge it, and that ordinary people cannot. It is also worth noting the presence within Strahd's extended history of Lissa von Zarovich, his great niece, who managed to transform herself into a vampire and use that transformation as the basis for a direct challenge to his rule. Lissa represents a uniquely interesting case, someone who chose vampirism specifically as a weapon against a vampire lord, who used the transformation as a tool rather than suffering it as a consequence. Her conspiracy with High Master Illithid to create a race of vampiric Illithids as an army capable of deposing Strahd failed, and she was eventually brought low through poisoning. But her story demonstrates that the vampire hierarchy is not merely a structure imposed from above. It is a structure that can be challenged from within using the same tools that create it. What adventurers who enter Barovia discover is that the Court of Strahd is less a political structure than a psychological one. Strahd does not need advisors or allies. He has had enough centuries to be his own advisor. What he has instead is an audience, witnesses to his continued existence and continuing relevance. And the adventurers who come seeking to destroy him are, for a time at least, the most interesting audience he has had in a very long time. Jander Sunstar and the Elven Court. The complexities of vampire courts are further illustrated by the story of Jander Sunstar, a gold elf who became one of the most unusual vampires in Forgotten Realms lore. Jander's story is significant because it explores what happens when a vampire manages to retain something of their mortal values, not perfectly and not without cost, but enough to make them a genuinely different kind of being from the standard vampire archetype. Jander was transformed against his will and spent significant energy trying to understand and combat what he had become. He was drawn into conflict with Strahd, whose court and methods represented everything Jander most despised about what vampires could choose to be. The encounter left Jander severely wounded but alive, and his subsequent decades as a vampire hunter represent an attempt to use the capabilities of undeath against its worst expressions. He eventually fathered a Dhampir daughter, Savra, who would go on to hunt vampires herself, including potentially her own father, in a cycle of predator and predator hunter that reflects the complexity of what vampirism does to families and lineages. What makes Jander philosophically interesting is not that he succeeded in remaining good, because the full details of his story are complicated, and he was not immune to the corrupting psychology of vampirism, but that he tried. He represents the possibility within the vampire condition that the transformation is not absolutely deterministic, that the individual who enters it with sufficient force of will and sufficient awareness of what they are becoming might be able to shape the outcome rather than simply being shaped by it. This possibility is extremely threatening to established vampire courts, not because Jander specifically poses a military threat, but because his existence challenges the narrative that vampires must be what they are. The lords of vampire courts have an investment in the idea that vampirism inevitably produces certain kinds of beings, because that idea justifies the political structures they have built. A vampire who demonstrates that the corruption can be resisted, even partially, even with enormous difficulty, raises uncomfortable questions about the choices that other vampires claim they could not help but make. The psychology of the eternal. One of the most significant and underexplored aspects of vampire court politics is the effect of extended time on beings that are already psychologically distorted. Vampires are not simply immortal humans. They are beings whose relationship with time operates completely differently from the mortal experience. A human lives roughly 70 to 80 years in the standard case, and within that span must compress all their experiences, relationships, and development. Time is precious because it is finite. The urgency of mortality shapes how humans prioritize, what they value, how quickly they form bonds, and how deeply they invest in them. The knowledge that everything ends creates meaning by contrast. For a vampire, time is not precious in this way. There is nothing being counted down. The vampire, who has existed for 500 years, can look back at events that would fill many human lifetimes and assess them with a perspective that no mortal can access. They have seen kingdoms rise and fall. They have watched ideologies cycle from dominant to heretical, to forgotten to rediscovered. They have outlived everyone they once knew and begun the process of outliving the next generation of people they have known, and the one after that. The initial response to this in most vampires is the hoarding behavior that vampire lords demonstrate so consistently. If time is infinite, if loss is inevitable because everyone eventually dies while you continue, the natural response is to invest in things that do not die. Art, accumulated knowledge, political influence, territory. The aristocratic display that vampire courts maintain is not merely pretension. It is a psychological strategy for managing the existential weight of continued existence. As centuries accumulate, even this strategy becomes inadequate. The art collection fills the vault. The territory is fully controlled. The political influence has been maximized within the available structure. And the vampire is left with the question that no amount of accumulated power can answer. What is any of this for? The boredom that Strahd experiences in the most recent versions of his character is not a minor personality quirk. It is the natural endpoint of centuries of isolation within a closed system that can provide no genuine novelty. This is why vampires who rule courts often introduce what appear to be irrational elements of chaos into their management of them. They create succession crises they could easily prevent. They play court members against each other in ways that destabilize the very structure they have spent decades building. They allow adventurers to enter their domains rather than eliminating them efficiently. These behaviors seem self-defeating, and in some ways they are, but they also create something the vampire desperately needs. Situations whose outcomes are not predetermined, interactions with beings who have genuine agency and might do something surprising. The adventuring party that arrives in a vampire's domain is, from this perspective, the most interesting event that has happened there in years. They have not been shaped by centuries of the vampire's influence. They have not had their independence eroded by decades of careful manipulation. They will do things the vampire cannot predict. And even if the probable outcome is their destruction at the vampire's hands, the process of getting there might be genuinely novel in a way that almost nothing else in the vampire's immortal existence can be. Vampire variants and the diversity of courts. The Forgotten Realms and D&D's broader multiverse contain multiple types of vampires, beyond the standard aristocratic undead that dominates the archetype, and the existence of these variants complicates the politics of vampire courts significantly. The Nosferatu, the feral vampire of old Ravenloft lore, represents what happens when the transformation strips away the sophistication without removing the power. Where the standard vampire maintains intelligence and the capacity for social behavior, the Nosferatu is more clearly monstrous. They are older, uglier, and driven more directly by hunger. Courts, including Nosferatu, have a different power dynamic than those composed entirely of the more socially capable variants. The Nosferatu's utility is as a weapon rather than as a courtier, and vampire lords who employ them must manage the risk that the weapon might turn unpredictably. Vampiric mind flayers, documented in older Forgotten Realms materials, represent a particular nightmare scenario for vampire lords who have constructed their power on psychological manipulation. The mind flayer's native capacity for telepathy and mental domination combined with vampiric gifts creates a creature whose abilities in the area of psychological control potentially exceed those of the vampire lord who created or employs it. A court that includes vampiric illithids is one whose hierarchy is under constant subtle pressure from entities that can reach directly into other minds without requiring eye contact or proximity. Vampiric dragons are extraordinary exceptions to most of what can be said about vampire courts and their politics. A dragon that undergoes vampiric transformation does not enter a court hierarchy in the ordinary sense. Its power, its age, its accumulated wealth and territory, and its native draconic abilities make it a peer or superior to most vampire lords rather than a subordinate. Courts that include vampiric dragons organize themselves around that dragon rather than the dragon organizing itself around the court. Across Ravenloft specifically, the setting accommodates vampire variants for multiple species beyond humanity, including elven and dwarven vampires that carry their racial heritage into undeath. An elven vampire does not lose the centuries of life experience that shaped them before transformation. A dwarven vampire retains the cultural framework and stubbornness that defined them in life. These cultural inheritances shape the specific character of the vampire that emerges, which means that a court composed of vampires from multiple species backgrounds will express its dysfunction in more diverse ways than one composed entirely of former humans. Across these variants, what remains consistent is the fundamental challenge of the transformed emotional psychology. Whatever specific abilities a variant brings, whatever physical form the vampirism takes, the underlying corruption of what the creature values and how it relates to others creates the same kinds of political tensions that define all vampire social structures. Different creatures express the same dysfunction in different ways, but the dysfunction itself is constant. Orcus and the demonic origin. Understanding why vampires exist at all in D&D cosmology requires some attention to Orcus, the demon prince of undeath, who has a significant claim on the creation and spreading of vampirism across the multiverse. Orcus presides over the concept of death divorced from its natural role in the cycle of existence, death not as transition but as a state that persists indefinitely and serves only the purposes of the dead at the expense of the living. The relationship between Orcus and vampires is not one of simple ownership. Vampires do not universally worship Orcus, and Orcus does not directly control them the way a god controls a cleric. The connection is more fundamental and less personal. Vampirism is one expression of the undead principle that Orcus embodies, a specific form that the rejection of natural death takes when applied to intelligent beings of sufficient power. Where zombies and skeletons represent the bodies of the dead, animated without real consciousness, vampires represent the consciousness itself continuing past its natural end, refusing the dissolution that death requires. Orcus appears on the plane of Thanatos, the abyss layer associated with death and undeath, which is also a significant location for vampire activity. Powerful vampires who have exhausted the political possibilities of material plane courts sometimes find their way to Thanatos, where the rules of vampiric existence intersect with demonic politics in ways that can be enormously dangerous for anyone not already accustomed to navigating both simultaneously. Some vampire lords seek divine or infernal patronage as a way of supplementing their political position with cosmic backing. Kazzador's deal with Mephistopheles is one example, though his arrangement was transactional rather than devotional. He traded specific terms, the souls of his spawn, for specific knowledge. The Archdevil provided the ritual methodology. The Vampire Lord provided the fuel. Neither party owed the other anything beyond the terms of the agreement. The Amber Temple of Barovia, where Strahd made his original pact, represents a different kind of divine connection. The dark powers who operate through the domains of dread are not Orcus and are not the standard D&D pantheon. They are something older and in some ways more terrifying than either. Entities whose specific nature is deliberately obscured in the lore. Entities that collect powerful, tragic individuals and use their suffering as something, though what exactly the dark powers gain from their collections is a question the lore deliberately leaves unanswered. Strahd is theirs in a sense that other vampires are not, bound to his domain in ways that ordinary vampirism does not require, his existence serving some purpose that he himself cannot fully articulate. Hunting the court. The practical implications of vampire court structure for those who seek to disrupt or destroy it are significant and often underestimated. Killing the vampire lord, while certainly a worthy objective, does not necessarily end the court. The spawn who were bound to the Lord gain freedom at the Lord's destruction, and freedom for creatures who have spent decades or centuries in psychic captivity can produce wildly unpredictable behavior. Some collapse, some flee, some take the opportunity to finally do the things they had been prevented from doing, which in a court context often means old debts with other court members in violent and destabilizing ways. The structure of a vampire court contains its own vulnerabilities, precisely because it is built on mutual coercion rather than genuine loyalty. Any court member can potentially be turned against the others if they can be convinced that cooperation with outside forces offers better prospects than continued service. The information a single court member has about the Lord and the rest of the court is often enough to significantly advance the cause of those seeking to dismantle the whole structure. This is not simply a tactical observation. It is the specific insight that drives Astarion's entire arc in Baldur's Gate 3. A spawn who has spent 2 centuries under Kazzador's absolute authority is also a spawn who knows exactly where Kazzador sleeps, exactly what the ritual requires, exactly which of the court's defenses can be bypassed and how. The accumulated knowledge of captivity is also the accumulated intelligence of an operation, and that intelligence has enormous value to anyone seeking to destroy the court from within. The specific vulnerabilities that allow vampires to be destroyed are worth understanding in the context of court dynamics rather than simply as tactical information. Sunlight is the vampire's most feared weakness, and the one that most completely restructures vampire court geography. Every significant decision a vampire lord makes about their lair, their movement patterns, their scheduling of court business, and their engagement with the world is organized around the avoidance of sunlight. The result is that vampire courts are fundamentally nocturnal institutions whose power is structurally limited during daylight hours. Hunters who understand this use it deliberately, infiltrating a vampire's lair in the early afternoon when the lord and their court are in their resting places and the spawn cannot act independently represents a window of vulnerability that patient attackers can exploit. Running water, sunlight, and consecrated ground remain the practical tools of vampire destruction. But navigating a court of multiple vampires while deploying these tools requires careful sequencing and the management of a dynamic political situation, rather than simply overwhelming one powerful creature. The adventurers who approach a vampire court as a combat problem rather than as a political one typically find that they have won a battle while the court has survived and learned from the encounter, and that the lord they thought they had killed has drifted back to their resting place in mist form and is already reconsidering what intelligence channels might have been compromised. The stake through the heart is not a killing blow. It is a paralysis technique, buying time for the final destruction rather than accomplishing that destruction itself. This is a detail that gets people killed. The vampire lying in its coffin with a stake in its chest is dangerous. The moment that stake is removed, or the moment someone decides the danger has passed and gets close enough to be grabbed. The only complete protection is destruction of the body through methods the vampire cannot regenerate from, and discovery and destruction of the resting place before the vampire can recover enough to defend it. The forbiddance that prevents vampires from entering a dwelling uninvited without an occupant's invitation is not merely an inconvenience. It is a structural feature of vampire court politics that every experienced lord has learned to work around. A court that cannot enter a particular building sends charmed servants instead. It manipulates the occupants into issuing invitations through seemingly innocent social channels. It waits for the occupants to venture outside, which they eventually must. The rule prevents direct incursion, but does not prevent the sophisticated forms of approach that a centuries-old intelligence can devise. What vampire courts reveal? The vampire court as a D&D institution illuminates something about what immortality actually costs, rather than simply what it provides. Every benefit of extended existence, the accumulated knowledge, the political influence, the immunity to ordinary mortality, comes paired with a cost that is inseparable from it. The psychological corruption is the price of the physical continuation. The isolation is the price of outliving everyone. The boredom is the price of having seen everything. The aristocratic trappings that vampire courts maintain are not vanity in the simple sense. They are coping mechanisms for existences that have outrun meaning and must create substitutes for it. The intrigue and the court politics and the careful management of relationships that could not possibly be called genuine friendships are what remain when everything else has been used up. They are the form of civilization after its content has been evacuated. There is also something revealing in the specific form that most vampire ambition takes. Kazzador wanted to become something that no longer needed blood, no longer feared sunlight, no longer had the vulnerabilities that define vampiric existence. He wanted, in other words, to escape from what he was. Strahd wanted to escape from the repetitive cycle that defines his imprisonment. Arthur Morlan wants, above all else, security, the assurance that what he has built will not be taken from him. These are not the ambitions of beings who have achieved what they wanted. They are the ambitions of beings who are profoundly dissatisfied with their circumstances, despite having more power than almost anyone else in the world. This dissatisfaction is the real core of vampire court psychology. The transformation did not give them what they wanted. It gave them power and eternity and the specific incurable hunger that makes every social interaction a calculation about feeding. What most vampires wanted in life was connection, recognition, love, security, belonging, the things that drive most mortal ambition. The transformation gave them the tools to take these things by force, and the psychological corruption that ensures that taking them by force produces nothing that resembles having them genuinely. The vampire lord seated at the head of the banquet table, presiding over a court of creatures who fear and resent them, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of centuries, is not the victor of existence that they appear to be from the outside. They are the prisoner of what they have become, unable to leave it and unable to change it, and increasingly unable to remember what they originally wanted from any of this. The court itself, with all its ceremony and hierarchy and carefully maintained forms, is the cage they have built around themselves while believing they were building a palace. Every spawn they have made is a chain. Every secret they hold is a weight. Every century they have survived is another layer of calcification over whatever was once genuinely alive in them. The adventurers who come to disrupt the court are not simply weapons aimed at an enemy. They are, briefly and without intending it, a window back to something that most vampire lords have not experienced in a very long time: surprise. Genuine uncertainty about what comes next, the sense that the future is not already written. These are things that only the living can offer, and the vampire who lets the adventurers leave when they could have killed them, who plays with them instead of eliminating them immediately, who offers the dangerous luxury of a conversation, is not being irrational. They are being desperate. They are reaching through the elaborate machinery of threat and intrigue that defines vampire court existence for the one thing that immortality cannot provide and that all the power in the world cannot purchase: the experience of not knowing what happens next, of being, for just a moment, alive to possibility rather than entombed by certainty. The vampire court is many things: a political institution, an economic structure, a survival mechanism for beings that cannot easily be killed. But underneath all of that, at its most fundamental level, it is the monument that beings who can no longer fully feel have built to prove that they still exist.